The flashing red and blue lights cut across the diner's cracked windows. But it was not the police that made the asphalt tremble. It was the deafening roar of military transport vehicles. Two arrogant deputies believed they were breaking a nameless drifter. Instead, they had just declared war on the United States military. The town of Oak Haven, Georgia, was the kind of place where the map seemed to give up. It was a quiet municipality, swallowed by tall pines that clung to the edge of an old winding highway most interstates had forgotten decades ago. In Oak Haven, the law was not dictated by the state constitution or the federal government. It was dictated by the men who wore tarnished silver stars on their chests. At the center of this isolated world stood a dilapidated eatery called the Rusty Diner. It smelled permanently of burnt coffee, old grease, and pine sol. On a damp evening, as rain drummed relentlessly against the tin roof, the diner was mostly empty. Sitting alone in the back corner booth was Julian Hale. He was a quiet black man in his late 30s. He wore faded denim jeans, heavy work boots, and a plain olive-drab canvas jacket that had seen better years. He was not a large man in width, but there was a dense, coiled energy in the way he sat. His posture was perfectly straight, his movements deliberate and economical. He was eating a plate of scrambled eggs and reading a battered paperback, completely minding his own business. He had been in Oak Haven for only a short while. His car, an old reliable Ford Bronco, had blown a tire a couple of miles down the highway, and he was simply waiting for the local mechanic to finish the patch job. The brass bell above the diner's front door chimed violently, splitting the quiet in half. In walked Deputy Harlan Reese and Sergeant Vance Keller. The two policemen were local legends, though not for any reason worth celebrating. Keller was a tall, heavily built man with a permanent scowl and a receding hairline, a 20-year veteran of a department that had never once been properly audited. Reese was younger, stocky, and built like a bulldog, driven entirely by ego and a desperate need to impress his superior. They treated Oak Haven like their personal kingdom, extracting attacks of fear and submission from anyone who crossed their path. The moment they walked in, the few locals scattered throughout the diner lowered their heads. Mabel Thorne, the elderly waitress who had owned the diner for years, stiffened behind the counter. She immediately reached for the fresh pot of coffee, her hands shaking slightly. Keller wiped the rain from his face, his eyes sweeping the room with the casual arrogance of an apex predator. His gaze skipped over the familiar locals and stopped dead on the back corner. Julian was sitting in their booth. It was not officially reserved, but everyone in Oak Haven knew that the large leather booth beneath the neon Pabst Blue Ribbon sign belonged to Keller and Reese. It was an unspoken law. "Well now," Reese muttered, nudging Keller with his elbow. He unhooked the rain flap on his holster, a completely unnecessary and intimidating gesture. "Looks like we got ourselves a tourist." Keller did not say a word. He simply smiled, a thin, cruel line that never reached his eyes, and began a slow, heavy march across the black and white checkered floor. Reese followed close behind, thumbs hooked aggressively into his duty belt. Mabel tried to intervene, hurrying out from behind the counter with two steaming mugs. "Evening, Vance. Harlan. Your usual table is occupied by a paying customer, but I've got a nice clean spot for you right up front." "Shut it, Mabel," Reese snapped, not even looking at her. "We're sitting where we always sit." They stopped at the edge of the table. Julian did not look up. He slowly turned a page of his paperback, took a sip of his black coffee, and continued reading. His calmness was absolute. In a town where everyone cowered, this lack of reaction was, to them, a profound and unforgivable insult. Keller slammed his heavy, wet hand flat on the table, rattling Julian's coffee cup and spilling a dark stain across the linoleum. "You're in my seat, boy," Keller said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Julian paused. He did not flinch, he did not jump. He methodically marked his page, closed the book, and finally looked up. His eyes were dark-piercing and terrifyingly steady. There was no fear in them, only a cold, calculating assessment. He looked at Keller, then at Reese, measuring them in a fraction of a second. "I didn't see a reserved sign, officer," Julian said. His voice was smooth, quiet, and carried a natural baritone that commanded the space without needing to be loud. "You don't need a sign," Reese barked, stepping closer, his hand resting conspicuously on his pepper spray. "Sergeant Keller just told you it's his seat, so you're going to pick up your little book, pay your tab, and get the hell out of our diner right now." Julian looked back down at his eggs, picked up his fork, and took a small bite. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and then looked back up at the two furious policemen. "I'm not finished eating," Julian said simply. "There are 6 empty booths. Feel free to take one." The diner went dead silent. The only sound was the heavy rain pounding on the roof. Mabel clamped a hand over her mouth. The regular patrons froze, knowing exactly what was about to happen next. No one defied Keller, ever, let alone a stranger. Keller's face turned a deep, mottled red. The veins in his thick neck bulged. He leaned in close, bringing his face mere inches from Julian's, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "Maybe you don't understand how things work around here," Keller whispered, the threat dripping from every syllable. "I need to see some identification right now. I want to know who you are, where you're from, and why you're stinking up my town." Julian sat motionless. The air between him and the two officers had grown thick and highly combustible. Legally, Julian knew he had broken no laws. He was a traveler passing through. His car was at the garage down the road. Once it was fixed, he would be on his way. He had no legal obligation to provide identification under these circumstances. "I haven't committed a crime, Sergeant," Julian replied, his tone remaining perfectly level, devoid of any aggressive inflection. "I'm a traveler passing through. My car is at the garage down the road. Once it's fixed, I'll be on my way. I have no legal obligation to provide you with my identification." Reese let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, we got a lawyer here, Vance. A constitutional scholar." Keller did not laugh. His ego had been bruised in front of the townspeople, and his authority was being openly challenged. In his mind, there was only one way this could end. "I'm giving you a lawful order," Keller growled, leaning his weight onto the table. "Show me your ID or I'm taking you in for obstruction and loitering." "It is an unlawful order," Julian stated calmly, "and I am a paying customer in a public business. That is not loitering." "That's it, get up," Reese yelled, losing what little patience he had left. He reached across the table, grabbed the collar of Julian's canvas jacket, and yanked hard. Most men would have stumbled forward, panicked, or thrown their hands up to fight back. Julian did none of those things. As Reese pulled, Julian shifted his weight instantly, allowing his body to glide out of the booth with fluid, controlled precision. He did not strike Reese, but he smoothly brushed the deputy's hand away from his collar with a sharp, rigid parry that stung Reese's wrist. "Don't touch me," Julian said. The volume of his voice had not risen, but the temperature in the room plummeted. The warning was absolute. Reese, shocked and embarrassed by the stinging pain in his wrist, drew his baton. "Resisting arrest. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Mabel stepped forward from the counter, tears welling in her eyes. "Vance, please leave him be. He paid for his meal. He ain't doing nothing wrong." "Back off, Mabel, or I'll shut this health hazard down permanently," Keller barked over his shoulder. He unclipped his own handcuffs, stepping aggressively into Julian's personal space. "Turn around, boy, now." Julian looked at the two men. He calculated the variables. He was highly trained in close-quarters combat. He could dismantle both of these out-of-shape, heavily laden officers in a matter of seconds. A strike to the throat, a knee to the floating rib, a joint manipulation, and they would both be on the floor choking on their own spit. But Julian Hale was not a man who operated on impulse. He was a professional. Striking a law enforcement officer, even corrupt ones, would trigger a massive local response. It would compromise his privacy, delay his journey, and potentially create an incident that his commanding officers would have to untangle. He made the tactical decision to comply for now. Without breaking eye contact with Keller, Julian slowly raised his hands, presenting his wrists, and turned his back. "Smart choice," Keller sneered. He violently grabbed Julian's arms and wrenched them behind his back, deliberately tightening the steel cuffs until they bit deeply into Julian's wrists, cutting off the circulation. "You're going to learn today." Reese stepped up and aggressively patted Julian down, his hands rough and invasive. He reached into Julian's front pocket and pulled out a sleek, black, heavy-duty smartphone. From the back pocket, he took a simple, dark leather wallet. "Let's see who we got here," Reese muttered, opening the wallet. "Process him outside," Keller ordered, shoving Julian forcefully toward the diner doors. "Get him in the rain. Cool him off." Julian stumbled forward slightly from the shove, but immediately regained his perfect balance. As they marched him toward the door, the other patrons looked down at their plates in shame. They were witnessing a gross abuse of power, but fear kept them paralyzed. As Keller pushed him through the front doors and out into the freezing Georgia downpour, Julian spoke over his shoulder. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, Sergeant," Julian said quietly. "I've heard that before." Keller laughed, shoving Julian hard against the side of the police cruiser. The cold, wet metal bit through Julian's jacket. "You're nothing. Just another loudmouth who's going to spend the next few days in a cell with no windows." "I'm not a loudmouth," Julian replied, turning his head slightly so the rain ran down his face. "And I won't be in your cell for 3 minutes, let alone 3 days." The rain came down in sheets, soaking the 3 men to the bone in the dimly lit lot of the rusty diner. Keller shoved Julian face first against the cruiser's hood, keeping a heavy forearm pressed into the back of Julian's neck. Reese, standing under the small awning of the door, was excitedly digging through Julian's wallet. He expected to find a typical out-of-state driver's license, maybe a few maxed-out credit cards, or an expired insurance paper. Instead, he found almost nothing. There was a Georgia driver's license that read Julian A. Hale, but there was no address listed, only a P.O. box in Washington, D.C. There were no credit cards, no family photos, no receipts, only a single matte black card made of a strange, heavy composite material. It had a gold-embedded chip, a barcode, and a holographic seal of the Department of Defense. But unlike typical military IDs, there was no rank, no branch, and no expiration date. The only text printed on the front beneath a highly classified clearance code read, "Authority Directive 7, Joint Chiefs Command." Reese frowned, his thick brow furrowing. He had seen military IDs before. Oak Haven wasn't far from a National Guard armory, but he had never seen anything like this. "Hey, Vance," Reese yelled over the rain, stepping out into the downpour and holding up the black card. "This guy's military, but his ID is weird. Looks fake. Says Joint Chief something." Keller scoffed, digging his forearm deeper into Julian's neck. Stolen valor added to the charges. Probably bought it online to get discounts at the hardware store. "It's heavy, though," Reese said, turning it over in his hands. He looked at Julian's phone, the black rugged device he had pulled from the pocket. He pressed the power button, intending to snoop through the messages. The screen illuminated, but there was no lock screen, no keypad, no background photo. The entire screen simply glowed a dull red, displaying a single line of text. "Unauthorized access detected. Biometric fail." Suddenly, a loud, sharp beep emitted from the phone. Reese jumped, nearly dropping the device. The phone beeped again, louder this time, followed by a rapid series of electronic chirps. "Shut that thing up!" Keller yelled. "I'm not doing anything," Reese shouted back, frantically pressing buttons, but the device was completely locked out. Beneath Keller's crushing weight, Julian finally smiled. It was a small, chilling smile. When Reese had forcefully grabbed him inside the diner, Julian had subtly pressed his thumb against the side button of his heavily encrypted tactical watch. It was a dead man switch linked directly to his phone and, by extension, a highly secure satellite network. By failing the biometric scan, Reese had verified a hostile interception. "What's it doing?" Keller demanded, momentarily letting off the pressure on Julian's neck to look at the blaring device. "I think it's sending a signal." Reese panicked, his bravado finally starting to fracture. Julian lifted his head off the hood of the cruiser. "It already sent it," he said clearly over the rain. Keller spun Julian around, slamming his back against the side of the car. "What did you do? Who did you call?" "I didn't call anyone, Sergeant," Julian said, his eyes locking onto Keller with an intensity that made the veteran cop's stomach drop. "The system called them. You triggered a Level 1 distress protocol for a Tier 1 asset." "Tier 1? Reese stammered. He didn't know exactly what that meant, but he had watched enough movies to know it wasn't good. "Stop letting him get in your head," Keller roared, though his own voice trembled slightly. "He's bluffing. He's a nobody." Keller reached for his police radio clipped to his shoulder to call for transport. He pressed the mic button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I need a transport van to the Rusty Diner." Only static hissed back. Keller frowned. He pressed it again. "Dispatch, Unit 4. Do you copy?" Nothing but dead white noise. Reese pulled out his own cell phone to check his signal. "Vance, I have no bars. Service is totally gone." Keller looked around the dark, rain-swept highway. The streetlights flickered. A strange, heavy silence seemed to have descended over Oak Haven, swallowing the town whole. The crickets had stopped. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Then they felt it. It started as a vibration in the soles of their boots. A low, rhythmic tremor that traveled up through the wet asphalt. The puddle sitting next to the front tire of the police cruiser began to ripple in concentric circles. "What is that?" Reese whispered, backing away from Julian and looking down the dark, empty stretch of Highway 9. The vibration grew into a deep, guttural rumble. It did not sound like a semi-truck. It sounded like an earthquake rolling toward them. Julian stood completely still against the car, the rain washing over him. "I told you, Sergeant, you made a catastrophic mistake." Through the heavy sheets of rain, about a mile down the highway, two bright LED headlights pierced the darkness. Then two more appeared behind them. Then 4. Then 8. A massive convoy of towering, heavily armored vehicles was tearing down the old highway, driving with zero regard for the speed limit. They were not local SWAT. They were not state troopers. They were matte black Joint Light tactical vehicles and heavy troop transports. And they were heading straight for the Rusty Diner. The rhythmic tremor vibrating through the soles of Sergeant Keller's boots escalated into a bone-rattling earthquake. The blinding glare of high-intensity LED headlights swallowed the dark expanse of Highway 9, cutting through the torrential Georgia downpour like a barrage of white-hot knives. The convoy was not just approaching. It was swarming, consuming the road with a terrifying, synchronized aggression that defied the slick conditions. "What in the hell?" Deputy Reese whispered. The encrypted tactical phone slipped from his trembling, rain-slicked fingers and tumbled to the wet pavement. He didn't even attempt to pick it up. His eyes were locked, wide and unblinking, on the mechanized leviathans tearing toward them. These were not local National Guard supply trucks. Leading the pack were 3 Oshkosh Defense Joint Light tactical vehicles, painted in a matte black radar-absorbent coating that seemed to drink the ambient light. Behind them roared a pair of heavily armored, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, their massive diesel engines drowning out the thunder cracking overhead. Trailing the armor were 4 sleek, blacked-out transport vans, stripped of all civilian markings, their windows tinted to an impenetrable pitch black. Keller released his grip on Julian's neck and took 2 slow, unsteady steps backward. His mind, conditioned by years of unchallenged dominance over the terrified citizens of Oak Haven, simply could not process the tactical nightmare unfolding before his eyes. He instinctively reached for his radio again. "Dispatch, dispatch, this is Keller. We have unauthorized heavy armor entering city limits. I need the sheriff down here right now." The radio responded with nothing but an eerie, rhythmic static. a localized jamming frequency that had completely isolated a 2-mile radius of the diner from the rest of the world. The lead JLTV didn't just park. It aggressively jumped the curb, its massive mud-caked tires crushing the decorative wooden planters outside the rusty diner into splinters. The vehicle angled itself diagonally, completely barricading the front entrance. The second and third JLTVs aggressively flanked the diner's parking lot, their heavy tires screeching against the wet pavement as they blocked the north and south highway exits. The trap was sprung. The perimeter was sealed in seconds. Inside the diner, Mabel and the few remaining patrons hit the floor, terrified by the overwhelming noise and the blinding light sweeping through the cracked windows. Before the engines even idled down, the heavy ballistic doors of the vehicles kicked open simultaneously. It was a masterclass in modern kinetic warfare. Dozens of heavily armed elite operators poured out into the rain with silent, terrifying precision. They moved not like regular soldiers, but like a single predatory organism. They wore unmarked olive-drab tactical gear, advanced plate carriers, and high-cut ballistic helmets with panoramic night vision goggles flipped up. In their hands were suppressed carbines and compact submachine guns held high and tight to their chests. "Federal agents, secure the grid! Nobody moves!" a voice bellowed through an external tactical megaphone, the sound echoing ominously against the tall Georgia pines. Footsteps slammed against the wet asphalt, dozens of them, moving in perfectly coordinated fire teams. 2 operators immediately vaulted onto the roof of the adjacent hardware store, setting up overwatch positions with heavy sniper rifles. 4 more moved to the rear of the diner, clearing the alleyway. The main element formed a tight tactical semicircle around Keller, Reese, and the police cruiser. Keller, acting purely on decades of misplaced arrogance, unholstered his service weapon. He didn't point it, but he held it down by his side, an aggressive and fundamentally stupid gesture of defiance. "Hold it right there," Keller roared over the storm, his voice cracking slightly. "This is Oak Haven police jurisdiction. You are trespassing on a live crime scene. I am ordering you to stand down." The response was instantaneous and chilling. A cacophony of metallic clicks echoed through the rain as safety selectors were flipped from safe to fire. Suddenly, the dark, rain-swept parking lot was illuminated by a constellation of crimson. Dozens of separate red laser dots materialized out of the darkness. Several settled perfectly on the center of Reese's forehead. A dozen more painted Keller's chest, neck, and the hand holding his service weapon. Reese shrieked, a high-pitched sound of absolute terror, and instantly threw both of his hands into the air. He dropped perfectly to his knees in the puddles, weeping openly. "Don't shoot! I didn't do anything! It was him! It was Keller!" Keller froze. The sheer volume of firepower pointed at him was paralyzing. The red lasers cut through the heavy rain, creating bright crimson lines connecting the muzzles of the rifles directly to his vital organs. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. The gun in his hand suddenly felt like a useless, heavy brick. He was hopelessly outmatched, outgunned, and entirely out of his depth. Slowly, carefully, using only his thumb and index finger, Keller dropped his weapon. It splashed into a puddle at his feet. He raised his hands, his broad shoulders slumping in total defeat. Through it all, Julian Hale hadn't moved a muscle. He remained leaning against the side of the police cruiser, his hands still tightly handcuffed behind his back, the freezing rain continuing to soak his canvas jacket. He looked at the laser-painted officers with the same cold, detached expression he had worn inside the diner. "I tried to warn you, Sergeant," Julian said, his voice easily carrying over the idling diesel engines. "But you refused to listen." From the center of the convoy, the massive doors of the primary command vehicle hissed open. The heavy steel ramp lowered with a loud mechanical clank, hitting the pavement. The perimeter of soldiers instinctively shifted, parting down the middle to create a clear, unobstructed pathway from the command vehicle directly to the police cruiser. The men stood at strict attention, their weapons still trained on the two corrupt cops, but their posture radiating absolute respect for the man who was about to step out into the storm. A heavy, polished combat boot stepped off the ramp, splashing into the rainwater. The man who emerged did not look like he belonged in a muddy, forgotten town in rural Georgia. He wore a crisp, dark utility uniform, completely unbothered by the torrential downpour. On his collar gleamed the unmistakable, heavy silver stars of a flag officer. He was Admiral Everett Lang, a man carved from granite. In his late 50s, he possessed a sharp, angular face, steely gray eyes, and a posture that exuded absolute, uncompromising authority. He walked with a measured, deliberate stride. Two heavily armed Marine raiders flanked him, but the Admiral waved them back. He didn't need protection from two small-town bullies. The silence in the parking lot was profound, broken only by the relentless rain and the low hum of the military vehicles. Keller swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the weather. The arrogant strut was gone. The petty tyrant of Oak Haven had been replaced by a terrified man realizing the true scale of his insignificance. He watched as the Admiral walked right past him, not even affording the sergeant a single glance. Admiral Lang walked directly to the police cruiser. He stood in front of Julian, looking at the bruised, tightly handcuffed wrists behind the man's back. The Admiral's jaw tightened, a dangerous flicker of anger igniting in his gray eyes. "Report, Commander Hale," Admiral Lang said, his voice booming with a deep, authoritative cadence that commanded the very air around them. Reese, still kneeling in the puddle, let out a choked gasp. "Commander!" The quiet, unassuming black man they had just assaulted, insulted and unlawfully detained, was a high-ranking military officer. "Situation is stable, Admiral," Julian replied calmly, his posture remarkably straight despite the awkward angle of his bound arms. "I was intercepted while waiting for civilian vehicular repairs. These two individuals requested identification without reasonable articulable suspicion. Upon my lawful refusal, they initiated physical force, unlawful detainment, and unauthorized search and seizure of federal property." Lang's eyes drifted to the mud-covered tactical phone, lying on the ground near Reese's knees. "They attempted to access the encrypted network." "Affirmative," Julian confirmed. "The secondary biometric failsafe was triggered. Protocol dictated the automated distress beacon." "Get these cuffs off him, now!" Admiral Lang barked over his shoulder. A towering Marine raider immediately stepped forward, pulling a heavy pair of bolt cutters from his tactical rig. He didn't bother asking Keller for the keys. With one brutal squeeze, the thick chain of the handcuffs snapped like a dry twig. The Marine carefully guided Julian's arms forward. Deep, angry purple lacerations had formed around Julian's wrists where the metal had cut off circulation. Julian rubbed his wrists slowly, wincing only slightly before turning to fully face the Admiral. He offered a crisp, flawless salute. Admiral Lang returned it immediately. "Are you severely injured, Julian?" Lang asked, his tone dropping its booming volume, for a brief moment of genuine concern. "Negative, sir. Superficial bruising," Julian replied, retrieving his heavy canvas jacket that had slipped off his shoulder. "Though I am severely annoyed that my scrambled eggs got cold." Lang allowed a grim, humorless smile to touch his lips. He then turned slowly, his boots scraping against the wet asphalt, and finally locked his gaze on Sergeant Vance Keller. Keller felt his blood turn to ice water. The laser sights painting his chest seemed to burn hotter. "Do you have any earthly idea who you just assaulted?" Admiral Lang asked, his voice deathly quiet, yet carrying an edge sharp enough to draw blood. He walked slowly toward Keller, stopping until he was uncomfortably close, forcing the taller cop to look down into the Admiral's furious eyes. Keller opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His bravado was entirely extinguished. "You didn't just harass a civilian, Sergeant," Lang continued, his words striking like hammer blows. "You unlawfully detained Commander Julian Hale. Commander Hale is a Tier 1 deep cover asset attached to a highly classified Joint Operations Directive. He has spent the last many months operating in hostile territories you couldn't find on a map if I held a gun to your head. He has neutralized international threats that would make you wet your cheap polyester trousers." Reese whimpered from the ground, his face buried in his hands. "And yet," Lang said, gesturing sharply toward the diner, "he comes back to his own country, minding his own business on a brief shore leave, and is assaulted by a pair of overweight, corrupt tin pot dictators wearing tin badges." "Admiral, we didn't know," Keller finally stammered, his voice pathetic and shaking. He didn't identify himself. He was being insubordinate. It was standard police procedure. "Do not insult my intelligence by citing procedure," Lang roared, stepping completely into Keller's personal space. The sergeant flinched backward. "I know exactly who you are, Vance Keller. While we were in transit, my intelligence officers pulled your entire digital footprint. We pulled the Oak Haven Police Department's records. We know about the extortion. We know about the racial profiling. We know about the cash you and your deputies have been skimming from highway seizures. You've been operating a criminal enterprise under the color of law for years." Keller's eyes widened in absolute horror. He had spent years carefully burying his dirty deeds, intimidating witnesses, and paying off local judges. And, in less than 10 minutes, the United States military's intelligence apparatus had peeled back his entire life. "You thought you were the biggest fish in this little pond," Lang sneered, his lip curling in disgust. "You thought you had absolute power because the state authorities were too lazy to look into this forgotten stretch of highway. But you made a fatal miscalculation tonight. You dragged the federal government into your backyard." Admiral Lang turned his back on the trembling sergeant and looked toward his command vehicle. "Major Grant," he called. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped forward from the perimeter, a pair of heavy military-grade zip ties hanging from his tactical vest. "Sir, arrest these men," Lang ordered coldly. "Charge them under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for the assault of a superior officer, interference with federal intelligence operations, and attempted theft of classified military hardware. Contact the FBI field office in Atlanta and hand over the evidentiary files we just compiled on their local corruption." "Wait! You can't do this! You don't have jurisdiction!" Keller screamed, a sudden desperate panic seizing him as Major Grant and two other operators moved in. "This is a local matter. I demand a lawyer. I demand to speak to the mayor." Major Grant grabbed Keller by the collar of his wet uniform, the exact same way Reese had grabbed Julian inside the diner, and violently spun him around, slamming him face first against the hood of the police cruiser. The impact echoed loudly in the rain. "Your local jurisdiction ended the second you assaulted a Tier 1 operator," Major Grant growled in his ear, roughly pulling Keller's arms behind his back and securing the heavy plastic zip ties with a sharp, vicious zip. "You are now property of the federal government." On the ground, Reese didn't even resist. He willingly put his hands behind his back as another operator secured his wrists, sobbing hysterically into the puddles. Julian watched the entire scene unfold with absolute emotional detachment. He reached down into the mud, picked up his heavily encrypted tactical phone, and wiped the screen clean on his sleeve. The red warning light vanished, returning to its sleek, dark interface. The reign of terror in Oak Haven was officially over. It hadn't ended with a lengthy trial or a town uprising. It had ended because a corrupt bully picked the wrong booth on the wrong night to harass the wrong man. Admiral Lang walked back over to Julian, his posture softening just a fraction. "Your vehicle, Commander?" "At the local garage, sir. It requires a tire patch." "Leave it," Lang commanded. "I'll have a logistics team transport it to base. You're riding back with me. We have a debriefing scheduled, and it seems your brief peace and quiet have been thoroughly compromised." Julian gave a short, affirmative nod. He looked back toward the diner. The faces of Mabel and the locals were pressed against the rain-streaked glass. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, awe, and an overwhelming sense of profound relief. The dragon had been slain. Understood, Admiral, Julian said. He adjusted his canvas jacket, the heavy rain washing the last bits of mud from his boots. But if it's all the same to you, I'd like to go back inside for a moment. I need to pay Mabel for my eggs. The heavy glass door of the rusty diner creaked open. The familiar brass bell chimed a weak, rattling note that felt entirely out of place against the backdrop of idling diesel engines and military-grade communication chatter. Julian stepped back inside. He was dripping wet, his canvas jacket heavy with rainwater, but his posture was as composed and perfectly balanced as it had been when he first sat down. The atmosphere inside the diner had fundamentally shifted. The suffocating tension of fear, the invisible weight that Keller and Reese had carried with them, had been violently shattered, replaced by a stunned, breathless awe. The half-dozen locals who had cowered in their booths were now standing. They looked at Julian, not as a stranger, but as a ghost who had somehow manifested to exact divine retribution. Mabel was leaning heavily against the main counter, one hand clutching a damp dish towel over her heart. Her wide eyes locked on the black man who had just dismantled a years-long dictatorship without throwing a single punch. Julian walked methodically toward the counter, his boots squeaking softly against the checkerboard linoleum. He reached into the small, hidden interior pocket of his jacket, a pocket Reese's sloppy search had completely missed, and produced a crisp $50 bill. He placed it gently on the laminate counter, right next to the cash register. "I apologize for the disruption, Mabel," Julian said, his smooth baritone cutting through the silence of the room. "The eggs were excellent. Keep the change." Mabel stared at the bill, then slowly looked up at Julian. Tears, hot and heavy, finally spilled over her wrinkled cheeks. She reached out with a trembling, age-spotted hand and gently pushed the money back toward him. "No, sir," Mabel whispered, her voice cracking with raw emotion. "Your money's no good here. Not tonight, not ever. What you just did, what you brought down on them, you gave us our town back. The meal is on the house, Commander." Julian looked at the money, then at Mabel. He recognized the profound weight of her gratitude. In a town where compliance had been extorted daily, offering a free meal was her way of reclaiming her own agency. He offered a small, respectful nod and slid the bill back into his pocket. "Thank you, ma'am. Be safe." As Julian turned to leave, an older man in faded overalls, a local mechanic named Elias Boone, who had spent years being aggressively ticketed and harassed by Keller's deputies, stepped out from his booth. He didn't say a word. He simply stood at attention as best as his bad knees would allow, and gave Julian a slow, deep nod of absolute respect. One by one, the others followed suit. It wasn't a military salute. It was the quiet, profound gratitude of a liberated people. Julian acknowledged them with a silent glance and stepped back out into the freezing Georgia rain. The parking lot had transformed from a perimeter lockdown into a highly coordinated command center. Admiral Lang was a man of overwhelming action. He hadn't just brought the hammer down on the Oak Haven Police Department. He had orchestrated a complete structural dismantling of their corrupt ecosystem. 3 sleek black Suburbans came tearing down Highway 9, their hidden grille lights flashing brilliant red and blue. They bypassed the military blockade, waved through by the perimeter guards, and skidded to a halt near the command ramp. Out stepped several men and women in sharp, dark windbreakers bearing the bold yellow letters FBI. Leading the federal agents was Special Agent Donovan Pierce from the Atlanta field office, a sharp, meticulous man with a buzz cut and a binder clutched tightly to his chest. Pierce marched directly to Admiral Lang, extending a hand. "Admiral!" Agent Pierce shouted over the rain, shaking the flag officer's hand. "We received the data packet your intelligence boys beamed over. I've got a federal judge signing a sweeping racketeering and corruption warrant right now. We're raiding the precinct house, the mayor's office, and Keller's personal residence." "Good," Lang grunted, crossing his arms. "The physical assets are yours, Pierce. We secured the area and prevented the suspects from destroying evidence or accessing localized networks. But the men themselves, they belong to me until the military charges are processed. They assaulted a commissioned officer of the United States Armed Forces. That supersedes local corruption. Understood, Admiral, Pierce said, adjusting his glasses and looking over at the police cruiser. Sergeant Vance Keller and Deputy Harlan Reese were kneeling in the mud, heavy military zip ties binding their wrists, surrounded by a ring of stoic, unmoving Marine raiders. Keller looked like a deflated balloon. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his situation had finally crushed his spirit. He wasn't going to a friendly local jail, where he knew the guards. He wasn't going to face a local judge he had bribed. He was facing federal racketeering charges, compounded by a tribunal under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. His life, as he knew it, was effectively over. Thompson, for his part, had stopped crying and was now just staring blankly at the wet asphalt in a state of clinical shock. Agent Pierce, Lang continued, his voice sharp. My cyber division unlocked their patrol car's dash cam and the precinct's encrypted communication logs. Keller has been running a narcotics protection racket on this stretch of highway for a cartel affiliate operating out of Savannah. He's been seizing cash from innocent drivers under civil asset forfeiture, padding his own offshore accounts and using his deputies as a private enforcement squad. It's all neatly organized on a flash drive my tech just handed to your lead investigator. Pierce whistled softly. We've had whispers about Oak Haven for years, Admiral, but they always kept it just quiet enough, and our resources were stretched too thin to justify a deep dive without concrete evidence. You just handed us a gold mine. Consider it a gift from the Department of Defense. Lang replied flatly. Clean this mess up, Agent. The citizens of this town deserve better than thugs with badges. Julian walked up to the two men, his presence instantly causing Agent Pierce to straighten his posture. Pierce knew about Tier 1 assets. He knew the level of classified clearance this man carried. Commander Hale, Pierce said respectfully. Glad to see you're unharmed. We'll take it from here. Julian looked past Pierce to Keller, who was currently being hauled to his feet by two massive Marines. Keller made eye contact with Julian, his expression a pathetic mixture of profound regret and lingering terror. Sergeant, Julian called out. The Marines paused, holding Keller in place. Keller swallowed hard, rainwater dripping from his nose. What? What do you want? You asked me for my identification, Julian said, his voice entirely devoid of malice or gloating. It was simply a statement of absolute fact. Now you know who I am. I hope the answer was worth the cost. Keller closed his eyes, his head dropping in ultimate defeat as the Marines dragged him toward the back of a heavily armored transport van. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, sealing the tyrant of Oak Haven inside a dark, inescapable cage. The storm finally began to break. The torrential downpour faded into a light, misty drizzle, and the heavy, oppressive thunder rolled away toward the distant Appalachian foothills. Julian climbed into the back of the command vehicle, the thick ballistic doors sealing shut behind him with a heavy, pressurized hiss. The interior was a stark contrast to the rustic diner. It smelled of ozone, gun oil, and diesel. Banks of high-tech communication screens glowed with maps, thermal satellite imaging, and encrypted data streams. Admiral Lang sat across from him in a shock-absorbing jump seat, unhooking his utility belt and letting out a long, heavy sigh. You always manage to find trouble, Julian, even when you're explicitly ordered to avoid it, Lang said, a faint glimmer of paternal amusement breaking through his hardened exterior. I assure you, Admiral, I was merely attempting to consume a plate of scrambled eggs, Julian replied dryly, grabbing a sterile towel from a compartment and drying his face and hair. I didn't invite the altercation. You never do, Lang acknowledged, his tone turning serious. But you're too valuable an asset to be left exposed, even on domestic soil. When your biometric failsafe triggered that distress beacon, The Joint Chiefs practically had a heart attack. We are hours out from a major operation. If our lead operational commander went dark in a backwater Georgia town, it would have compromised a multi-billion-dollar intelligence initiative. Julian rubbed his bruised wrists. I had the situation under control, sir. I could have neutralized them physically. But standard protocol dictates minimizing collateral damage and local law enforcement entanglement. I opted for compliance to allow the system to handle it. And you made the right call. Lang nodded firmly. If you had put 2 cops in the hospital, corrupt or not, it would have generated a media circus. The last thing we need is a viral video of a federal operator dismantling local police. By letting the fail-safe work, you gave us the legal authority to drop the hammer on their entire corrupt operation. The MRAP's powerful engine revved, sending a deep vibration through the heavily armored chassis. The driver's voice crackled over the internal comms. Admiral, perimeter is secured and broken down. FBI has assumed control of the site. We are clear to roll out. Take us home, Sergeant, Lang ordered. Outside, the massive convoy of matte black JLTVs and armored transports began to move, pulling out of the Rusty Diner's parking lot and merging back onto Highway 9 in a flawless, synchronized column. The flashing lights of the FBI vehicles were left behind, casting long shadows across the broken wooden planters and the empty, abandoned police cruiser. As the convoy rumbled down the dark highway, Julian looked out the small, thick ballistic window. The pine trees blurred past, shadows in the night. He thought about Mabel, about the old mechanic, about the townspeople who had lived in a perpetual state of anxiety. He was a man who spent his life hunting international terrorists, dismantling global threats, and operating in the dark corners of the world to keep his country safe. But sometimes the worst threats were the ones festering right at home, hiding behind a badge and a false sense of authority. What happens to Oak Haven now? Julian asked quietly, watching the road. The FBI will gut the local government, Lang answered, pulling up a tablet. The governor is being notified. They'll send in state troopers to act as an interim police force until the department can be rebuilt from the ground up. Real officers this time, not thugs. By the time the sun comes up, Keller and his deputies will be sitting in federal holding cells waiting for a military tribunal to chew them up and spit them out. Julian nodded slowly. The system, for all its flaws and blind spots, had finally worked. As dawn broke over Oak Haven, the golden light of morning pierced through the thick canopy of Georgia pines, casting a warm, hopeful glow over a town that felt distinctly lighter. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere that had choked the community for years was gone, washed away by the storm and the extraordinary events of the night before. At the Rusty Diner, the open sign buzzed to life. Inside, the coffee was brewing. The smell of fresh bacon filled the air, and for the first time in memory, the diner was packed. People weren't whispering. They weren't looking nervously at the door. They were laughing. They were talking loudly. They were sharing stories. Mabel walked over to the back corner booth, the large leather booth beneath the neon Pabst Blue Ribbon sign. It was no longer reserved for tyrants. Several young local men were sitting there sharing breakfast and talking about the future. On the table, sitting quietly in a small, cheap plastic picture frame, was the crisp $50 bill Julian had left behind. Mabel had framed it. It wasn't just currency anymore. It was a monument. It was a reminder that no matter how dark things get, no matter how deeply corruption roots itself, bullies always fall. Somewhere high over the Atlantic Ocean, Commander Julian Hale sat in the back of a heavily modified C-17 Globemaster, his tactical gear strapped on, reviewing intelligence dossiers for his next high-stakes deployment. He was thousands of miles away, returning to the shadows to fight the battles no one would ever hear about. But in a small, forgotten town in Georgia, his legacy was cemented in the sunlight. A quiet black man had walked into a diner, asked for nothing but peace, and ended up giving an entire town its freedom. The fall of the corrupt Oak Haven police proves that true power doesn't scream. It sits quietly, waiting for the right moment to strike. Commander Hale's legendary composure against arrogant bullies is a masterclass in tactical patience, showing that justice always arrives when the real heroes step into the light. If you loved this story of ultimate karma, hit that like button, share this incredible takedown with your friends, and subscribe for more epic real-life justice stories.